Rachel Nicholson, Amnesty International's Burundi researcher. A very good evening to you, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, you have observed Burundi for quite some time now. Does Amnesty International strongly believe that Burundi is silencing the media?
Yes, Amnesty International does strongly believe that Burundi is silencing the media, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about that this evening. These latest bans and suspensions are just part of a much longer history of restrictions and retaliation against the media. Burundians' key independent media houses were destroyed in 2015 during the failed coup d'etat. Hundreds of journalists have fled the country since then. Many human rights defenders have also fled the country. So this really falls within the context of a clampdown on the free flow of information to and from Burundi. And it's obviously very concerning as we are preparing for the elections that are expected in 2020, that this is the context in which they're likely to take place.
What is it that these broadcasters are doing wrong, if at all, for them to be slapped with such action?
As you mentioned in the report, the Broadcasting Council, the National Communications Council, took issue with particular broadcasts that the BBC had made. So one was a documentary in December last year that used crowdsourced footage and interviews with people in exile and others to document the use of torture and arbitrary detention and killings in unofficial places of detention in Burundi. That's not a case that we ourselves have documented, but it was a clear indication of how media houses, even from outside the country, were able to expose the serious human rights violations that are happening in the country. And it does appear to be the main concern of the government that they are still able to do such documentary work from abroad. And one of the things that is particularly concerning about the latest decision is this new measure that's been brought in, which forbids any journalist in Burundi, be they a Burundian national, be they with an international media house, from sharing any information with VOA or BBC that could be broadcast. This is really a new level of restriction on the free flow of information that we've not seen before.
Yeah, and speaking of restriction, as you mentioned, that country's regulator also banned journalists from working for either organization. This looks like serious censorship, is it not?
It is indeed. But I would have to say that one of the things that we've seen that's been very encouraging from the start of this crisis is when we've seen so many journalists and human rights defenders go in exile, they found ways to continue reporting from exile. So many of the media houses that were shut down have restarted their operations from abroad. They maintain their websites, they broadcast radio shows on WhatsApp and online. And there are also still, we should acknowledge, there are still journalists who are working independently in Burundi, who are managing to get well-balanced information out there.
And we understand that a journalist remains missing and many others are still in exile. Would you say that journalists in the country are under siege?
I think that would be a fair representation. The case that you're referring to is that of Jean Bigirimana, a journalist who worked for a media outlet called Iwachu. He went missing in July 2016, and to this day, despite investigations, particularly by his colleagues, he's still not been found. His family's not been informed of his whereabouts or his fate. And you can just imagine how traumatic that is for a family not to know what's happened to the father of the family, to their key breadwinner, to someone who's so close to them.
I mean, and 3 teenage schoolgirls jailed in Burundi for scribbling on a picture of President Pierre Nkurunziza in textbooks have been released on bail. I mean, how do you view freedom of expression in general in that country?
The case of the schoolgirls is quite striking. In fact, it was actually 7 schoolgirls who were initially arrested, and then 1 was released quite quickly and 3 were released later. These schoolgirls are accused of scribbling on their textbooks. I don't believe that that's been proved yet. Obviously, there's a case before court, and we're calling for those charges to be dropped. They're accused of insulting the president. That carries a very high sentence of 5 years in prison for a matter that should be resolved within, as a disciplinary matter within schools. And what's particularly astonishing about this case is that we saw similar cases in 2016, which equally evoked a huge outcry in Burundi and abroad, but yet we're seeing the similar cases being brought forward again. And if we're looking at school children being criminalized for acts of misbehavior, which I'm sure many of your viewers may have indulged in themselves in the past, it's just quite stunning.
I mean, it's really interesting because some of them are as young as 15 years. I mean, and just last weekend, Burundi released the first 142 prisoners from a promised 3,000 detainees to sort of promote reconciliation. This must be a positive response from the government.
This is a positive response from the government. It's not enough. We'd like to see further releases. And there are other measures. It's a good step forward, but there are other measures that the government can take to show willing to improve the human rights situation and to, just create a freer environment for expression and for those who don't necessarily agree with the views of the government. They can create an environment for the reopening of the media houses and for human rights defenders to return home. And the dropping the charges against these schoolgirls would also be another positive step. One of the people who wasn't released from prison is a human rights defender called Germain Rakuki, who was convicted last year to 32 years in prison. And that was merely on the grounds of his human rights work. He was accused of undermining state security just for his human rights work. So again, cases like his would again send a really positive message if the charges against him were to be dropped and he were to be freed.
The World Press Freedom Index of 2018, compiled by the advocacy group Reporters Without Borders, has ranked Burundi as 159th out of 180 countries worldwide. I mean, this does very little to salvage the battered image of the country.
Absolutely. We've seen in the last few years that there have been attempts at the regional level, at the international level, to foster dialogue between opposing parties, to try to reopen civic space. We've seen attempts to monitor the human rights situation, to have a frank dialogue about what is happening in the country and to propose recommendations. We even saw in September 2017, the Burundian government at the Human Rights Council at the UN themselves proposed sending in a team of experts to provide recommendations on the way forward. And that team of experts got into the country and was within a few days had their visas withdrawn and were told to go home. That's on top of the other independent human rights mechanisms that the Burundian government has completely refused to cooperate with, and for whom the members of those mechanisms, many of them have been declared persona non grata in Burundi. There are so many avenues and channels that are being opened for dialogue and for the possibility to work together to improve the situation of human rights in Burundi and to have a freer space before the elections. And yet the Burundian government is just rebutting those possibilities. Those doors are still open, and we would really encourage them to take those opportunities.
I mean, you just mentioned the United Nations sending in experts to monitor the situation in that country. I mean, apart from that intervention from the United Nations, on the international relations front, what does that do to the relationship that Burundi has with other countries in the world? What kind of attitude do other countries have with Burundi with regards to media freedom?
It's a very tense relationship between many countries and Burundi at the moment. We've seen that a number of countries have really stood up for the rights of journalists and human rights defenders in calling for that space to be reopened and valuing the work that they do. There's one of the things that's been so encouraging recently, particularly you mentioned the case of the schoolgirls, is actually the solidarity that we've seen regionally and internationally from fellow citizens saying, both Burundians and outside Burundi, saying that this is not acceptable. So whereas governments have been doing their part, we've also seen citizens doing their part in showing solidarity and saying that what is going on is not acceptable.
I mean, with regards to some of the journalists in Burundi who have gone missing, are we likely to see the same kind of action that was taken against Saudi Arabia in the disappearance and the ultimate death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi?
That's not something that we've seen to date. We have seen a continued engagement from the international community. We see the AU, for example, has monitors on the ground. They don't report publicly, but they have maintained a presence and they're sharing information. The UN, states via the UN have attempted to create that level of accountability, but we've seen, for example, that the Commission of Inquiry has not been allowed to conduct research in the country. So yes, there are attempts, but we've not seen the same level of engagement as we did see on the case of Jamal Khashoggi.
All right, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. That was Rachel Nicholson, Amnesty International's Burundi researcher, speaking to us via Skype.